Well, certainly one of the many, many issues that will be impacted by the change in Congress and the change in the administration is our approach to pharmaceuticals and drug prices. Um, and couldn't think of anybody better to be with us today to guide us through sort of the deep background of how all this works and where we're at. So Dr. Askin, of course, is associate professor of medicine at UCSF and at is it this called the San Francisco VA?
Yeah.
Great, great. And so thank you so much, Elizabeth, for leading us today.
Thank you. And I will say, Mark, I only adjusted one slide post-election. So not that many changes right now. Okay. In terms of sharing, I have a sequence of things I have to do with my screens here. So, okay. Do you guys see a blue screen?
We do.
Okay. And now you should see slides.
All
Yes?
good. All good.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm excited to be talking to you about pharmaceutical pricing and policy today. This is a really big topic, and I'm going to be staying general, trying to focus on understanding the big picture, diving in a little bit here and there on areas of interest to me. I'm going to start with a little bit of background data and a few graphics, nothing new or earth-shattering to this crowd. And then we're going to review in two sections or areas. First, the micro level of the drug distribution system and pricing, and then the macro level of federal regulation and incentivization of the drug industry. And my only disclosure is that I am not an economist, and we should all go into this talk with the knowledge that it is by necessity oversimplified and incomplete. And I just noticed something happen with the chat. It's really hard for me to monitor the chat while I'm in this slide. So please, Mark, just stop me if there's anything I should address as we go.
Of course, we'll do.
Okay, so into our graphics. The first graphic is showing how per capita drug spending has risen precipitously over time. So you can see that there's an upward trajectory in each OECD country here, but it's the 1990s when the US really breaks away from the pack. Breaking down this rise in overall spending in the US on drugs, you can see that insurance spending on medications has really increased too. 40 years ago, medications were largely an out-of-pocket expenditure, but now most people have a prescription drug plan. Note that Medicare didn't enter this stage until the early 2000s, and that drug spending is a higher proportion, not total, but proportion of commercial plan health spending than of the other government payers listed here. You can see that Medicaid line was really rising at one point and then started to fall. Drilling down further to specific medications, we see that spending on some drug classes has risen more precipitously than others. In this chart, the light blue dots are spending in 2009, and the dark navy dots are spending in 2019, all in constant 2019 dollars. While most but not all classes show an increase, the rise in spending there at the top is most notable in cancer, diabetes, and autoimmune drugs, and these are largely classes with biologics. Biologics are expensive, but they're also expensive to create. This graphic is just a reminder of the cost to bring a drug to market. However, note first that we only have estimates about what that cost is, and second, that those estimates vary widely, depending in large part on how friendly to industry the author of the estimate is. I don't know what the answer is. Clearly, it costs a lot to bring a drug to market. We can say roughly, at or near $1 billion. At the same time, I think it's helpful to put those numbers in the context of sales. Looking at the top 10 pharma companies here, I have marked in the dotted red box what % of total sales each company's R&D spending represents. So while R&D is expensive, like we just said, $1 billion maybe to bring a drug to market, it's not like these are no margin companies. And with that little whirlwind tour of data, we're going to, just to set the stage, we're going to now turn to our micro level view of the drug distribution system, which includes many interested parties. I think it's easiest to start with the original interested parties, say 100 years ago. At that time, you had the business, the manufacturers of drugs. You had pharmacies, and you had patients who bought and took the drugs. This system was easy to understand. Now, and this is a really famous chart that you might have seen before, we have a lot more interested parties, including middlemen of wholesalers and pharmaceutical benefits managers, and a lot more lines in between these interested parties. In addition, this graph leaves out two additional parties or group, which are government regulators and, very important, though we aren't going to get into this today, a global supply chain. The main thing to get from this slide is not to really seek to understand okay, where do these arrows go? But really is to see just how confusing and chaotic this system is. There are a lot of relationships, rules, and details that are encapsulated here by a line. And they're really important to making the system run and to understanding it. And it's actually very hard to make generalities without specialized knowledge. That's why we're staying up on the bird's eye view. So just a word on two of these middlemen. PBMs get the most attention, but like PBMs, wholesalers are also a highly concentrated market of middlemen. The point of wholesalers is to offload and create efficiencies in distribution of drugs between about 1,300 manufacturers and then a staggering 180,000 points of sale. The vast majority of all drugs sold in the US pass through one of three wholesalers. Wholesalers take a small cut on branded products, a larger cut on generics. Now, regarding PBMs, I won't go into this too much. PBMs are highly consolidated. Most drugs, sort of are touched by them. They're not physically. Essentially, the idea of PBMs is to outsource formulary development and price negotiation with manufacturers from the health plan to the PBM. This PBM strategy is to get rebates on high drug costs in exchange for formulary placement. So the actual list price, the prices that you see don't change. And higher prices, in fact, will bring you a larger rebate if that rebate is seen as a percentage of the price. So PBMs used to have some worse practices, but many of those actually have been regulated and outlawed over the past 5 years. And I do want to emphasize, I just mentioned it, that PBMs are not themselves actually involved with the storage or physical movement of medications. It's really all about how those medications are priced or paid for and where they are in formularies. So whether or not any of these middlemen touch the medications physically, they all take a cut in the final cost. So where does all of that money go? Here, we're looking at a hypothetical $100 spent by a patient. So you can see my stressed out little patient there on the left. And they're spending that $100 either on generic drugs, which is that bar on the left in the middle, or branded drugs, the bar on the right. And who captures what amount of that $100? You can see that for the generics, each party takes a roughly even-sized bite. But on branded drugs on the right, of course, it's almost entirely the manufacturer who sees that $100. You can see the orange bar is the majority of that, or the orange section is the majority of that bar. This is why, even though generic drugs are so much cheaper, because of that bigger cut, they actually make up the bulk of revenue for middlemen. So you see all those different sections in the middlemen and the cuts that they are taking. And a question might occur to you, why even have all these middlemen? Can't we just get rid of them? That's certainly a tempting thought. I think it's important to remember they do serve important functions. And if we want to get rid of them, who is going to do those functions? It may not be so easy or predictable for the original parties, the pharma and health plans, to take on these functions themselves. And that makes sense, right? The bigger and more complex a system gets, the more localized expertise develops in terms of, how to handle these formularies, things like that. Um, and it's just like having specialists and subspecialists instead of only family general practitioners. Business kind of follows those same lines of hyper specialization. In fact, the presence of middlemen themselves may be less concerning than their consolidation and anti-competitive behavior. Relative power and the relationships shown on that earlier chart, the confusing lines, actually comes largely from their size of each of those parties. And the need for that power drives consolidation and vertical integration, like you see here on this chart. So on this chart, notice CVS, for instance, there in the middle, is integrated with Oak Street Health, Aetna, and the largest specialty pharmacy in the nation, as well as CVS Pharmacy itself. So where do you think they make the most money? How does that affect their negotiations across those relationships? Not to mention their lobbying in Congress. Does anyone know who this is?
FTC chair.
FTC commissioner.
Yeah, that's Lena Khan, the current commissioner of the FTC, who made her name first in antitrust. In September 2024, the FTC sued the top 3 PBMs, alleging that they behaved anti-competitively in driving insulin prices. Trump is going to replace Khan. This is the one thing I changed. But he actually is likely to support an ongoing focus on PBMs, which has been pretty bipartisan. And Trump himself has made a number of statements over the years anti-PBMs. So on the note of insulin and antitrust a little bit further, here's a chart from a House Oversight Committee report in 2021, which compares the first 2 short-acting insulin analogs, Humalog and Novolog. Here we're looking not at overall spending, but at list prices. And we could see what could be fairly called lockstep increases between these two from their launch dates and to about 2019, as well as a more than 10-fold per unit price increase in Humalog since launch. Accounting for inflation alone, the cost would have only gone up about $11 during this time period. Sure, maybe it cost $1 billion to bring Humalog to market back in 1996, but did Humalog get more innovative and cost them more money to produce over the next 20 years? And here we have to take a time out and say, wait, were patients really paying $300 per package for insulin in 2018? So much more than in 1996. If not, then what do we mean by that price? What even is the price of a drug? It turns out that figuring out the actual price or cost of a drug is quite slippery. First of all, there are many vocabulary terms for the prices as they move along the supply chain. In this little box on the left, I'm only showing some. You can think of the WAC, or wholesale acquisition cost, as basically like that list price, or as like the sticker price on an auto. It's the starting reference point, but when you go to the dealer, you end up paying something different than that sticker price on the car, and your Uncle John pays something else different than you. Second, the amounts that plans, including Medicaid, negotiate for their payments is typically confidential. Several states have enacted policy or are in the process of enacting policy related to drug pricing transparency as a basic step towards reform. Can we even know what we're paying for these medications? So drug companies say, hey, you can't blame us for those rising list prices in that chart, or those list prices are whack. We have to pay higher and higher rebates to PBMs. Remember, that's their business model. They threaten us. We have to pay rebates just to get our meds on formularies for health plans. We have to raise our prices just to keep even with those rebates. So rebates are key to understanding both explaining that precipitous rise in prices, those charts just going up and up, while also demonstrating that list prices don't reflect what almost any individual patient is paying. The rising difference between the prices drug companies list their drugs at, that WAC or list price, versus the net after rebates. So you can see here what I'm pointing to right here, or here, right here, is called by Adam Fine of the Drug Channels Institute the gross to net bubble. And here I have this little star to give my metaphor, which when I told this to Matt, who hopefully is on the call, he told me it was a very San Francisco metaphor, but San Francisco is where I am. So that's what you're going to get. So it occurs to me this is a very similar thing in some ways to private school tuition. My kids go to public school, but here in San Francisco, private schools often charge tuition at like $50,000 or $60,000 a year. However, they give huge tuition discounts to many families. Many families qualify and they'll say, hey, you know, I got a 70% discount on my tuition. I'm only paying $12,000 or $13,000 a year for my kid to go to this private school. And so what ends up happening is you have a similar gross to net comparison in that tuition. So, you know, parents who are sending their kids to these schools and saying, oh, I got a huge discount, you know, I'm pretty happy. The schools can say, hey, almost everybody gets a discount. We do a great job giving these discounts. And yet they leave those high list tuition prices for the families who can afford them the most, who don't qualify for the discounts or rebates in my metaphor. And the opposite is what's happening in the pharmaceutical realm, which it's not the people who can most afford to pay those high list prices, and you know everybody else who needs it gets the rebates or the discounts. It's actually the people who are most vulnerable, who are not protected by a health plan, the people who are uninsured or who are underinsured, who are totally seeing those high list prices. So when we get angry about those prices and those patients who aren't insured and can't afford their insulin, I do think it's important for us to remember what goes into setting those prices. So what drives any given drug price? Well, as we've touched on, high cost of production definitely plays a role. Then drug companies consider the anticipated size of the market and the seriousness of the disease. Competition from other drugs will drive down prices. Having to pay middlemen and give rebates goes into that accounting line as well, clearly. Then there's the relative power in the negotiation room, a time when big players went out over small players and when evidence of clinical effectiveness of a drug may finally play a role in haggling. Ultimately, though, I believe prices are set at what the market will bear. In a complex system, lack of transparency and monopolies raise the level of that tolerance. No better example of what the market will bear than when Biogen cut in half their price for Aduhelm, a controversial Alzheimer's drug, in 2021. So they listed it at something like, you know, 56,000 a year. There was a big controversy about this. Was it going to even make it onto Medicare formularies, things like that? And they decided, well, we're going to just cut it in half. That's what the market would bear. On that note of Aduhelm, which many felt didn't meet sufficient clinical effectiveness criteria for approval and is actually now no longer on the market as of this year, there's no standard for the role clinical or cost effectiveness plays in pricing or payments. Though in some countries, obviously there is, our sort of OECD comparator countries, such as the UK. These countries take a much sterner eye toward the efficacy of medications and how that translates into what they're willing to cover and for how much. This table is taken from a 2023 article that compares these countries' determination about the top-selling Medicare drugs, finding that many would actually be considered low value in other countries. And there is something similar in the US, though, which is called ICER, or the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. ICER is modeled after the comparator in the UK, and it looks at medical therapies broadly, focused mostly on new therapies. They put out research that many can and do argue with, sort of inherently controversial whenever you determine value. No one has to listen to this research. There's no mandate to, certainly, but increasingly they do. ICER had a big impact on what some states paid for Hep C treatments, for instance, really informing those negotiations with Medicaid. To a certain extent, the question of value or pricing cannot be determined by research evidence because we get muddled in a question not of cost value, but of societal or moral value. What are we willing to pay for whom? How much is too much for what kind of benefit? For what kinds of benefits and indications should we be willing to walk away? And on that note, let's turn away from the micro level of the drug distribution and payment system to look at the macro level of federal drug regulation policy. So the government's task is to help foster safe, effective innovation while working to ensure equitable access. Historically, lawmakers have mostly been interested in the safety of new and available drugs, ensuring good manufacturing process for current drugs through the FDA, as well as incentivizing innovation with new drugs. Here's a timeline to 2020 of laws creating the FDA and its regulatory power. We're not going to go into all of these. I'll note that the FDA itself was created in the 1930s, though its precursor was about 30 years prior to that, literally as a way to protect people from snake oil salesmen. And I do want to briefly mention just a few of these laws and their impact. The first is the Kefauver-Harris amendments, which, spurred on by the thalidomide crisis in the early 1960s, required drug companies to demonstrate evidence of efficacy and not just safety. However, this had the unintended consequence of making drug development by really making robust phase 3 trials much more expensive, and that got pushed down and raised drug prices. I'm getting confused on my slides. Okay, so next we have something I actually added to this graphic because it's not technically an FDA related law. And that's the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. Bayh-Dole allows academia and industry to take out patents on new drugs that used government-funded research in their development. So just a word more on this issue. Some people say that the Bayh-Dole Act actually means that the government pays twice for medications. After all, the NIH does a lot to fund basic research that's used to ultimately develop drugs. Shouldn't that investment lead to some kind of discount? I will note that researchers have looked at this and they suggest that while industry R&D uses publicly funded research findings quite often, it's still less than 50%. And the public sector only did enough discovery to warrant a patent in 20% of important drugs, although 20% actually strikes me as rather high. A timely example of this issue is the mRNA vaccines. The federal government heavily funded development and then purchased a huge number of vaccine doses. And now Pfizer and Moderna have raised the cost of those vaccines. You can argue that we should pay big time in such an important situation, but I think you'd have to concede that we did pay twice. Okay, back to our timeline. In 1984, we have the Hatch-Waxman Act, which created a trade-off, encouraging bringing generics to market, but also allowing branded drugs to extend their time on patent. It turns out, and this is pretty important, that for most drug companies, figuring out how to further and further extend patents is a much better return on investment than that $1 billion R&D to bring a new drug to market is. And which is, obviously a problem in terms of propping up those high prices with the extended patents. But now, unlike the 1960s or the 1980s, where I showed you, those laws were really focused on innovation, generics, all of that. Government is also a major purchaser of medications. We don't just regulate, we don't just fund basic science. In 2024, Medicare has 709 Part D plans, all of whom have engaged in their separate negotiations and deals with PBMs, et cetera. Both Medicaid and the VA, though, engage in meaningful tactics to lower their drug spending. The VA purchases as a whole, not by region, giving them a lot of negotiating power. And Medicaid engages in a rebate system of their own, ensuring that they receive the best price as compared to any commercial payers. So you can see in this analysis in the lower right-hand side that Medicare Part D spends considerably more on drugs than the VA does. And this comes from the GAO in 2017. So as not just a regulator of drugs, but a purchaser of drugs, as of 2022, we did get federal law requiring Medicare to negotiate drug prices at scale rather than each Part D plan for itself. It's a limited program for now, quite complicated, quite circumscribed in terms of what drugs Medicare can choose, what information they have to account for in negotiations. But as of 2026, Medicare will be paying negotiated maximum prices for 10 drugs, and then another 15 will be added by 2027. And I know there's a lot of words on this screen. This slide and the next couple of slides, I'm actually just, I didn't cut down for you to look at during the talk. I left more detail because I know Francine will send out these slides afterwards. So if people want to use this just for the information, I left it on there. So there's a little bit more detail here if people want to learn more about the Inflation Reduction Act impact on drug negotiations. So again, I had to warn you before I went to this slide. This is all of those 10 drugs that were slated in 2023 for negotiations, and those negotiated prices were published in 2024. They'll take effect in 2026. Again, leaving this, if anybody wants to look at this later, I cobbled together this information from several different sources. The one thing I wanted to call out for you was that red line, which is insulin. Insulin, the average out-of-pocket spending for someone on Medicare annually is $261. So obviously very different and kind of underscores that gross to net bubble, right? That most people who are insured on Medicare are really insulated from those WAC or list costs. And then in terms of the actual negotiation itself, you can see the list price for this went from $112 monthly to the negotiated price, which is $107 monthly. This won't have any impact on patients. It will have an impact on the bulk purchasing by Medicare. Of course, we shouldn't just think about the federal efforts. Again, this is a slide you guys can look more at later. I don't expect us to look at any of these small words, but we shouldn't forget about the state's ability to regulate drug pricing and distribution as well. So this is a chart based on information from the National Academy for State Health Policy, which shows a large number of states who have created laws regarding drug affordability. So I'm not going to go in through this chart. Same thing, I just highlighted and read what I wanted us to look at, which is the pharmacy benefits managers. And you can see, while 3 states have enacted laws about volume purchasing and 10 have enacted laws about affordability review, all 50 states have enacted a number of laws, 186 laws regulating PBMs in some way.
Elizabeth, can I interrupt for a second with a question?
Yeah.
This is, so at the state level, are we talking about Medicaid policy primarily? Or if not, what authority do states have to regulate or prices for private companies?
Great question. For many of these, this is Medicaid, yes. And some of these, so for instance, like with the pharmacy benefits managers, I'd alluded to some bad practices by PBMs that got put out previously. So for instance, they wouldn't allow a pharmacy to let patients know if purchasing a medication out of pocket was cheaper than getting it through their health plan. So some of the laws are regarding things like that.
Thank you.
Okay. So to listen to industry and industry apologists regulating pharma itself, like with the Inflation Reduction Act, they don't care about PBMs, but pharma cares about itself. So it means a death knell for all drug development and the end of innovation. Some will argue against this. saying, no, it won't harm innovation. They point to the VA as well as to other countries who negotiate at scale. But ultimately, asking whether or not Medicare's ability to negotiate drug prices will harm innovation is the wrong question. What we should be asking is how and how much should we pay for what kinds of innovation? Not all drugs and not all indications are created equal, after all. And there should be more nuanced ways of incentivizing the kind of drug creation we want to see. Antibiotics for drug-resistant diseases, perhaps cures for genetic diseases, acknowledging the taxpayer funding of the creation as well as the purchase of these medications. So to incentivize innovation and drug creation, you can make it easier or less costly to bring drugs to market. In a broad sense, this can be accomplished by funding basic science, making it shorter and easier to go through the FDA approval process, and then to pay more for drugs that do make it to the market. The US does all of these things, sometimes in a more general sense, sometimes more targeted, such as granting drugs for rare diseases, orphan status, though I think they're typically more general. These strategies, however, don't necessarily account for the type or relative efficacy of drugs, and they can be exploited, like with that orphan status. Drugs that we wouldn't consider really having orphan status for rare diseases can end up getting it for certain indications. So I went ahead and put that Operation Warp Speed logo up here again as a reminder of just how well government really can clearly facilitate bringing innovative new drugs to the market when they choose to. But incentives have to be balanced against reform, not just a cash giveaway to industry with an expectation of, an equal amount of innovation back. There has been or likely will be reform in each of the areas that I've listed here, on either the federal or the state level. There are many very different ways of tackling high prices, and many of these depending on knowing what those prices are, which is why increasing transparency is also a really key element of reform. Okay, I'm looking at my time. I think I did a good job of getting us to where I want, which is kind of summarizing and discussing some of this stuff with the example of insulin. So I'm hoping to just sort of set the stage, ask some questions, and then have us discuss a little bit. So Mark sent out an article, that I'd highlighted about insulin and the lack of generic insulin on the market. I don't know how many people were able to get to it, but if you can afterwards, I just think it's a great encapsulation of many of the problems. In any case, we're all familiar with insulin. The story of insulin and insulin analogs is really a perfect encapsulation of all the issues and problems with drug pricing. So as we know, insulin was, first discovered in the early 1920s. And as of now, there are two basic forms of insulin. There's the older forms of human insulin that few people use anymore. That's NPH and regular. And then there's the longer lasting insulin analogs, ever increasing list of them, in fact. The insulin analogs definitely offer greater safety and effectiveness in reducing both hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia, and in greater ease of dosing. Furthermore, because of a lack of generic competition, really because those insulin analogs were so much more effective, the old human insulins, there's no generic. They're not even cheap. You can't buy them for cheap outside of Walmart, which has sort of its own special deal of $25 per vial. So we end up with this messed up system in which vulnerable patients don't have access to old life-saving drugs, even the patients who are most feeling those list prices without any of the, bringing that down from their health plans. They can't even access, NPH and regular for cheap. What's more, we have more insulin innovation on the way. So Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are working on insulin icodec, which is dosed once weekly. Right as those insulin analogs we already know, the basal bolus, are starting to come off patent. We're starting to get some generics. or biosimilars, I should say. Now we're going to have a new one, insulin icodec. So being dosed once weekly is exciting. Already, icodec has some published research evidence showing further improvements beyond the daily basal insulin in terms of both safety and efficacy. However, the FDA just rejected Novo Nordisk's application for lack of sufficient safety data in type 1 diabetes as opposed to type 2 diabetes. Eli Lilly is still pushing through their form of insulin icodec, and I expect we're going to see this on the market sometime in the next couple of years. So my questions, and we can, focus on insulin alone. That's what my questions are about. But really, this is about any important medication, the medications that we all prescribe regularly. So the FDA has held up insulin icodec. We already know that the insulin analogs are an important innovation, have made a true difference in people's health and lives. And presumably insulin icodec may do the same. Some people would say the FDA is just, they're overly scrutinizing as a general rule, and that they just increase the cost of bringing drugs to market. They increase that $1 billion. It doesn't have to be that high, and it just makes patients wait unnecessarily. Back to that Operation Warp Speed, a lot of people were saying similar things, even with those expedited approvals at the time. So is that true? Is the FDA scrutiny on medications the right amount? The question is, it's definitely worth paying more for insulin analogs, but how much more? We see that rising list price, right? And how can we justify that over time? And how much more will the weekly dosing be? Again, how much more are we willing to pay for each marginal step and benefit? If insulin icodec does get approved, patients with cognitive disabilities would benefit greatly from a weekly rather than a daily injection. I have seen a number of patients who cannot inject themselves, and they don't have someone who can inject them every day, but they do have someone who could inject them weekly. Would make a big difference in their glycemic control. However, that's not everybody. Many people would be interested in this medicine for its convenience or for, again, its marginal benefit in terms of glycemic control. Are prior authorizations reasonable in that? Should we be doing some kind of gatekeeping in terms of thinking about overall drug costs? Again, where is that sort of cost benefit analysis in terms of what we should be paying overall with those rising costs for us as a nation? And finally, if nonprofit manufacturer Civica RX, this is something I've been really interested in, which is this is a drug manufacturer who they've mostly produced medications for hospitals that run into shortages. Well, if Civica RX begins in next year making truly cheap human insulins, they've been working on NPH and regular, is it reasonable for health plans or for state Medicaid programs to require these cheap, previously they were what we had for 20 years, to require those over more expensive analogs? I don't think any of these questions are easy. And really they speak to sometimes that societal value and not the cost effectiveness value. And this is part of what always interests me in this topic, is that I just don't think there are easy answers at all in terms of any of these questions. And I'd love to know other people's thoughts as well. I'm going to escape and stop share. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. So I know that was a whirlwind of data. I'm going to put those questions into the chat. I was hoping to hear some of your thoughts, and then also if you have questions from the things that I discussed as I went along.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Those are tough questions.
How much does the TRIPS agreement play into the cost of drugs globally?
What do you mean?
Uh, Drugs that are on patent have to be sold by the pharmaceutical at their designated price.
I don't know. I don't think I can answer that one, Preston. I don't know much about the global sales.
So the reason why I raise this is when AZT came on market, the pharmaceuticals were pricing it out of reach to the developing world. And the global community came together in a human rights campaign to force the global pharmaceuticals to lower their price, a la the Supreme Court in South Africa ruled that the government had failed to deliver the right to health of its citizens because it was not purchasing pharmaceutical AZT, but they were priced out of the market. So the generics made in India and Brazil were much, much, much cheaper. So that whole campaign forced the pharmaceuticals to lower the price.
Yeah. I try not to get too much into the global issues just because it kind of had our work cut out for us domestically. But I will say there's an
But
interesting aspect of that, which is, there's nothing like the FDA looking over those generics manufacturers. In fact, there's been major scandals in terms of not just ineffective, but frankly unsafe medications, antibiotics, and antiretrovirals produced at large generic manufacturers in India, and going largely to Africa. So, I will say, I think it's, oh, sorry, an even trickier problem, right? Which is that you can say like, great, we can get generics manufacturers who just produce medications more cheaply, but we don't want that to come at the cost of safety and efficacy. So the regulation from the FDA or something similar, in Europe, et cetera, is very important.
so we have a formal LEAP scholar who's on the Hill this year who's arguing that the FDA needs to be much more tightly regulated in
I
its
mean,
oversight activity.
I would agree. I actually think the FDA is vastly underfunded in terms of that. I didn't want to get into it, but I'm quite nervous about the lack of oversight into the global manufacturing system.
And that probably plays in domestically.
Yeah. Mark, I think you were going to say something.
Uh, it's a global comment, but it's a domestic question. As far as I understand, Cuba and Sweden are really the two main countries that have developed public manufacturing, publicly funded, publicly managed manufacturing of drugs. Cuba famously does it and ships it around the world. We don't officially buy from Cuba. But Sweden, a very different country from Cuba, has figured out a way to produce drugs at a much lower price with tight controls. It's a kind of a silly question, but what would it take to make room for public manufacturing here?
That's why I mentioned Civica RX. I'm very interested and excited about the potential for public manufacturing, or at least these, California is partnering with Civica RX. It's not publicly owned, it's just nonprofit. Of course, the issue there is it's only generics. And so for anything that's on sort of that like extended patent, you're not getting those, I think Humalog came off patent in like 2015 or something like that. I don't remember exactly. But so a lot of the medications we use and we think about with the high prices are still branded. So it doesn't solve that, but it does solve the issues, for instance, with like the human insulins. Or it wouldn't allow, the Martin Shkreli's of the world to suddenly make, a medication 700 times more expensive than it used to be, or allow, I think it was, am suddenly blanking on who, oh, Mylan bought EpiPens and raised the prices. So if you had public manufacturing, you wouldn't have those problems, but it wouldn't solve the issues with like who gets Wegovy, who gets, Lantus. I'm really curious people's thoughts on, would it be reasonable if we suddenly had cheap NPH through Civica RX for a state Medicaid to decide we are not going to cover the insulin analogs any further, or at least it's very, they're way down on our formulary. You have to fill out a bunch of prior authorizations. We're really going to focus on our regular human insulins, regular and NPH. Maybe a poll in the chat.
So what's the question? Would we
Would
prescribe it?
would you support that, or would you be angry about it?
It may be a slightly different question as to whether we would prescribe it. If we were
Sure.
if we were required, if it was the only drug available for a given group of patients.
What's the difference with the VA having on formulary only two medications that it's negotiated a lower price at, that its providers have to use?
Well, I'll defer to Mark. I joined the VA a month ago. But I will say it was very easy to prescribe a Lantus Solastar pen the other day, and it went through much faster than it is what I'm used to in the private sector.
Yeah, there are ways of ordering things that are not on the formulary that more often than not get approved, but the VA does live within a fixed formulary that most physicians stick with. And that
The other thing is,
prices
I've often educated people about NPH, how to use it, because if they somehow don't have access, they can go to Walmart and get it for free.
Mhm.
And so they always have access to an insulin if they run out and don't have, their more expensive EpiPen or their more expensive, insulin pen available.
Well, just to be clear, Walmart charges $25 per
Well,
vial.
all right, $25, but it's generally affordable.
Elizabeth, one concern is that it would create tiers of care as if we don't have those already, but diabetes coach versus diabetes comfort or business class. People will pay more for the convenience of a once daily or once weekly injection.
Yeah, and I just think that, oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Oh, no, Celeste, go for it.
I was just going to ask Elizabeth, what do you think about like the Civica RXs versus like 340B programs? Because I can get glargine for people for $20 through 340B through the safety net hospital. So I would probably lean that way and away from MPH, even if it was on some formulary for the state. But obviously this is complicated, but what do you think about that piece?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Celeste, because there's really, you're sort of answering it on two different levels, which is that we're in the exam room with a patient. And so we have to think about the cost for any individual patient. And it's not really our purview, how much is our overall costs burdening health plans and driving up premiums and, taking over state budgets, et cetera. But that is, what has to drive policy is thinking about those overall costs, for instance, for Medicare. And so really this would be something that wouldn't necessarily impact the bottom line for your patient on are they taking human insulins versus insulin analogs? In fact, for them, it would be slightly worse, right? Like the insulin analogs are clearly better than the human insulins, but it might have a huge impact, or making decisions like that would have a huge impact on that overall budget and those rising lines I showed in the first two graphics of drug spending overall and drug spending by payer. So the question for me, I think is sort of difficult to answer is like, well, how much extra innovation is worth, or extra clinical benefit is worth how much cost, right? Because initially those insulin analogs were not, they're prior authorizations or, something similar you had to have, they cost a lot more money. And then how much is that worth, not just on the individual level, but on a societal level?
Brian, what were you going to say? Have we breezed past your comment already?
Yeah, I think we've kind of breezed past it. I mean, yeah, to your point, Elizabeth, like I just think that safety, like efficacy is one thing, safety is another thing. And if something is slightly more efficacious, with a similar safety profile, then I don't know, then maybe there's a conversation about, what is offered at a lower tier, which would still be, acceptable to patients and would not maybe seem just, but would be closest to just. Whereas if new therapeutics come on board that are safer and lower tiers are still offering drugs that are just less safe and less effective, then that seems to be where the line could or should be drawn with what society is willing to pay and how society is willing to do that, or states or federal government.
I wanted to comment a little bit on, I guess, the first question that you had, that was is FDA holding up a great drug for patients and this great option just to be extra safe, the European countries do. But I used to be a reporter and I covered FDA, and I used to sit on these advisory committees and I'd write on them and stuff. And then the pharmaceutical company is always going to have patients saying, we need this, FDA, get out of the way. We need this option. This is important to us. But the other thing is, especially companies like Novo Nordisk, like these big companies, they regularly meet with FDA and know what FDA is expecting from them as far as their information goes. So I don't feel that bad for them. They'll come with the information that they need, and it'll come and FDA will make a decision. Now that's not always true, and it depends on what you're at and stuff, but and I can understand, like from the patient standpoint, be like, well, you're making me wait for this, but I feel like, I'm okay with them having to provide a little bit more safety data, especially since the issue was that people were having worse hypoglycemic episodes on this weekly injection. And so I think it is worth looking into that information, but no, but the whole reason why PDUFA fees even exist is because of the HIV epidemic and, and all of that. So, obviously, FDA can certainly play a role in slowing things down, but I don't know. I still think that they have a tough job, and I don't know. They always need more money to be able to do it quickly, I guess.
Anyone have any? Oh, go ahead, Preston.
Our keynote speaker last year, talked about being forced by public pressure to approve vaccines in kids without any data, and how morally distressing that is. And the difference between a COVID vaccine and HIV is one was terminal and one was preventive. Those are big barriers that aren't equal.
This is an area that I wonder, I don't have any bead on what's going to happen with our, post-election new administration, but, I just said, I think that there should be more funding for the regulatory power of the FDA, and I think it's going to be heading in the other direction.
I think that's clear, and there's certainly interest in the Trump administration to undo the capacity to negotiate prices because they're hearing it from the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
And Nancy would argue that also the FDA, in terms of its regulatory power over foods, which it does nothing. And so we have a whole food lobbying industry that has brought to market products that are really detrimental to the public's health.
Preston, that's Nancy Connolly, a LEAHP alumni who's finishing up her year as a health policies fellow with RWJ. The program that Tracy, who's listening in to both us and to Briefer as part of the RWJ program. I'm not sure, you've got 2 years, I guess, so you're doing both at the same time. Well, we're about at the end of time. I've just put in the chat that our next gathering will be on December 13th. I'll send out a request for information about your capstones that we will use to sort of listen and give you feedback on your work so far. And also, I'm not sure that we've communicated this, but on February 6th, which is a Thursday, we're adding a new happy hour at 8 o'clock Eastern time, where we're going to have an alumni panel. So graduates of the program coming back and talking about work they've done since and reflections on how they use what they learned to navigate their path forward. So I think that'll be a lot of fun for us to do as well. Elizabeth, thank you so much. This is really fabulous. It's sort of pull your hair out stuff, and you're able to really convey it with metaphors and clarity, and it's really, really helpful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope you liked my private school tuition metaphor. I'm
Yes,
proud of that one.
Yes.
Great job.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.